It begins with a spark.
Hey, Jackie, wait for me.
The passion for air and space.
Why don't you take it? You look better on you anyway.
Hey, Jackie, remember her?
That passion can grow. Lighting the way forward for a lifetime. And now, with the monumental transformation of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, this place that has ignited generations of imaginations will be completely reimagined, inside and out. Also, this museum can be even more of what it's always been. A place that gives life to a remarkable past and gives rise to the people who will make history tomorrow. Join us in the mission to transform the National Air and Space Museum. Together, we'll ignite tomorrow.
Good evening. I'm Chris Brown, the John and Adrian Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Vice Admiral Donald D. Engen Flight Jacket Night, the marquee lecture of the museum's National Air and Space Society. Thank you to everyone who has joined us both in person and online. It's great to see some flight jackets here in the audience, and I hope those of you online are wearing your own flight jackets for this occasion. And for those of you that may have joined the National Air and Space Society in the last year, and for whom this is your first flight jacket night, a bit of background. This annual event is named in honor of Donald Engen, a highly decorated Navy pilot and FAA administrator who also served as the director of this museum from 1996 until his untimely death in 1999. With this annual lecture, we strive to provide our members with unique access to the icons of aviation and space history. Flight Jacket Night is just one of the many ways we show our appreciation for you, the members of the National Air and Space Society. I hope you've enjoyed the first 4 issues of Air and Space Quarterly, published exclusively for our members. The magazine team is hard at work preparing our next issue. Your contributions are more important than ever as we undergo the transformation of our flagship facility on the National Mall. If you haven't had a chance to visit the 8 new galleries at that location, I urge you to do so. With your support, our team has done an outstanding job reimagining classic galleries and telling previously untold stories in brand new spaces. Timed entry passes are required to visit the museum in DC, but don't forget that we have set aside a select number of passes each day for Society members. For tonight's program, we are joined by Apollo astronaut Fred Haise. While Haise is most known for being the lunar module pilot on Apollo 13, NASA's successful failure, his inspiring career spans both aviation and space. He served as a fighter pilot in the Air Force and the Marine Corps, was a research pilot at NASA, and then became a NASA astronaut. After his time in the Apollo program, he also flew 5 flights as the commander of Space Shuttle Enterprise for approach and landing test program. With a career like that, I can't wait to hear what he has in store for us tonight. Joining him in conversation is the curator of our Apollo spacecraft collection, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony. Teasel, over to you to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Chris. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and like all of you, I'm very excited for the conversation that we're going to have shortly with Fred Haise. Before we begin the conversation, though, I wanted to share a brief overview of some of his accomplishments to help prompt some questions, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Pretty soon, hopefully, we can start that. Yeah, this is a great way to start. We'll talk about some additional challenges soon. So Fred Haise was born in Biloxi, Mississippi. He was raised there as well. Initially, he thought he would become a journalist, but things changed quickly for him when he decided to join the Naval Aviation Cadet Training Program. And this led to a remarkable flying career in which he accumulated over 9,000 hours of flying time in around 80 different vehicles, just over 80 vehicles, I believe. And then he would go on to serve as a U.S. Marine Corps fighter pilot, a flight instructor in the U.S. Navy Advanced Training Command, a fighter interceptor pilot for the Oklahoma Air National Guard, a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, a tactical fighter pilot and chief in the Ohio National Guard, and a research pilot for NASA. So I have a feeling I've also missed a few other positions. So instead, I'll share this wonderful compilation of all of the vehicles that he flew on throughout his storied career. But by the mid-1960s, he began to wonder what he should do next. And when Neil Armstrong visited NASA's Flight Research Center, Haise's friend asked him what it was like to be an astronaut. And Armstrong replied, "It's a lot of meetings with a lot of time sitting in simulators, not much good flying." But this did not dissuade Haise, who in 1966 became part of NASA's astronaut group 5, also known as the original 19. And here you can see them. So out of 5,000 applicants, 19 were selected for the Apollo program, as well as the ambitious Apollo Applications program, which initially included a lunar base and multiple space stations. They underwent medical examinations and interviews and received scores based on IQ, academic qualifications, NASA aptitude tests, a technical interview, pilot performance, and evaluation of character and motivation. So evaluated on many different capabilities. And who do you think was the top scorer in the group of all these applicants? Any guesses? Fred Haise, yes, and you can see him in the middle of the group here. This group was split in roughly in half, so 9 of them flew to the moon, including Haise, and half of them flew on Skylab and Space Shuttle, including Haise. So sitting in the middle is quite fitting. And in many ways, what Armstrong said about being an astronaut proved true. So 1,000 hours of mission-specific training, more than 5 hours for every hour of the mission's planned 10-day duration. And Haise served on the backup crew for 3 missions, the Apollo program on the primary crew for 1. So you can imagine how much training that was. And when he was on the backup crew for Apollo 8, and this was the first crewed mission to the moon, a lunar orbital flight, he started training 6 days a week. But a month before the flight, this turned into 7 days a week from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. So he spent his 35th birthday training for 14 hours. Okay. He was assigned to the primary crew of Apollo 13. Does anyone spot anything unusual about these crew photos for Apollo 13? Any ideas? No guesses? Sitting on a phone bucket, that's an interesting idea. So they're actually, well, I'll explain the story. I guess it's less familiar to this group. So a few days before the mission, the backup lunar module pilot, Charlie Duke, was exposed to measles. And the problem with that was that command module pilot Ken Mattingly, who was assigned to the primary crew, had no immunity to measles. And so within a few days of launch, they had to switch him out for the backup command module pilot, Jack Swigert. So you see that these are different crews here. And although this was a challenge, the first of many on this mission, the crew prepared themselves for launch just a few days later. So on April 11th, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off from the launch pad at KSC, and during the first 2 days of the flight, it was the smoothest of all Apollo missions. At 55 hours and 46 minutes, as the crew finished a television broadcast, they showed how comfortably they lived and worked in weightlessness, and then they signed off. And a few minutes later, the crew experienced a sharp bang. Swigert saw a warning light and said, "Houston, we've had a problem here." A short circuit inside one of the cryogenic oxygen tanks caused the tank to explode. And you can see a processed version of that image here. This tore away one side of the service module and damaged the other oxygen tank and the main antenna. The force of the explosion shut off 2 of the 3 fuel cells and left Apollo 13 with little power. With the oxygen leaking out slowly, they had a few hours to come to a solution to save the crew. The command module's normal supply of electricity, light, and water were lost about 200,000 miles from Earth. And they had to use the lunar module as a lifeboat, which you can see here. But the problem with that is the lunar module's supply of oxygen, water, and battery power had to last 4 days in deep space instead of what it was designed to do, was to last 2 days for a 2-person mission. And when we looked at this photo earlier this evening, Fred said he was sleeping on the job, which I think, if you can sleep on this mission, it's a pretty impressive feat in itself, because the amount of challenges, we won't go through them all right now, but hopefully in the conversation we can. Water was the main consumable concern because it was needed for cooling, and so the crew was forced to conserve as much as possible. They used only 6 ounces a day. That's about 1/5 of the normal intake, and Jim Lovell lost 14 pounds on that mission. Another major issue was the removal of carbon dioxide. The command module's lithium hydroxide square containers were not designed to fit in the lunar module's environmental system's round openings. And so mission control was called on to help find a solution, and the fix was plastic bags, plastic-coated cue cards from a 3-ring binder, hoses from the lunar spacesuits, and gray duct tape. After about an hour, the new device, although not terribly elegant, worked perfectly. And here you can see a version that we have at the museum. This is in the new exhibit downtown called Destination Moon, so you come visit us downtown and see it there. This is a recreation that was done for us by Mission Control for the museum. I want to share a few other examples of artifacts that we have in the collection related to Apollo 13 and Fred Haise's career. So we have a Fairchild wide-angle television camera lens, which was used with an RCA television camera during the Apollo 13 mission, and it allowed the astronauts to show a wider view of the spacecraft interior during broadcast to Earth. There's a slide rule for onboard calculations, and there's a glove that was a part of a pair of gloves made for Fred Haise. Here's another artifact that we have in the collection that was flown on Apollo 13. It's a micro-form Bible. It was a part of a series of them, and it was donated to the museum. So they splashed down on April 17th, and the Apollo 13 mission really highlights why the Apollo program was a success in general. It demonstrates the importance of planning, training, and what is possible when people come together to solve and overcome challenges. Haise went on to serve on the backup crew for Apollo 16 and then became part of the Space Shuttle program, not only as an astronaut, but also as a technical advisor. He was the commander of the Space Shuttle Enterprise in 1977 for the approach and landing test program at Edwards Air Force Base on a series of successful landings. And before we jump into the conversation, I just want to note two things here. He recently came out with a book that I highly recommend. These stories you can read about in so much more depth, and it's called Never Panic Early. And then there's a new website that he created called fredhaise.space with an incredible wealth of archival material and many of the images that you saw here tonight. But I highly recommend visiting it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So a very brief overview of that could have lasted much longer. I would like to start the conversation by asking you a question inspired by the title of your book, which is Don't Panic Early. So throughout your career, you had many opportunities to panic, many more than I even mentioned here. How did you stay focused? Did it come naturally to you, or was it something you learned? And do you have any tips for those of us who have a tendency to panic early?
Well, no, I'd say from the standpoint of my flying and certainly in the mission training I did, was training. It was the training you did, the experiences you had. I've had failures. I've been on fire 3 times in airplanes. Along the way, destroyed 2 of them. And the process, and so I've had things like that where you have to surmise your situation. The movie carried it very well. When right after the explosion, there was confusion, and there really was confusion in the control room, mission control, as to what happened. And the scriptwriter, I guess, wrote it in. I'm not sure Gene really said that, but he told them to settle down and look at your data. He said, we don't want to do anything too quickly and make things worse. So it's kind of look at your options. It's on a personal front for all of us. If we have a problem at home with an accident or with a child, one I used very recently, I probably used it in the book if it happened then, but it's more recent than the book's published. I was with my granddaughter next to me in the car. We had gone for an event in Biloxi, Mississippi from Houston, which is about a 7-hour drive. And we were driving back that night after this event and visiting with family there. And it was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, approaching 10. In Louisiana, we had passed Jennings exit, and we're right in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you couldn't only see any lights off the side of the road. And Dakota, my granddaughter, suffers a grand mal seizure. And I don't know if anyone has witnessed that. It's very scary, with her arms and legs flailing, breathing heavily, her head back. And all I could do was hold on to her, and while I'm thinking at the same time, what does Papa do? And I just told hang in there, Dakota. And first thing I said, I'll pull off the road and call for an ambulance. But then I said, well, I don't even have a road sign. I don't know where to tell them to come. I kept them off the road here in Louisiana, some miles after I passed Jennings. So I said, no, I just passed that exit, so I'll just press on to the next exit, which I did. And fortunately, there was a filling station there. By that time, Dakota had got to normal breathing, and she was unconscious, but I could hold her back against the seat and safely run in. And the lady was very smart about medical facilities, told me not to go to the next exit at Lake Charles because the hospital was well off the road. Go backwards where you came from to Jennings and call 911, and they'll have a sheriff waiting for me, and that's what I did. So I turned around and went back, and there was a flashing light waiting for me at that exit to escort me right to the hospital with Dakota, and she recovered. In fact, later that night, we drove on to Houston. As I said, she may never, it was one of these things, she may never have this again. had settled her down, so we left at about 2 a.m. and finished the drive to Houston that night. But I'm saying you have accidents like that in your home or yourself, and it's like don't do anything real quick. Think a minute about what your options are, what you can do, and try to pick the best of those so you don't, again, make things worse.
She was very lucky to have you in the car with her. Could you tell us a bit about the importance of teamwork throughout your career, and especially the role of mission control in Apollo 13, or all the people that contributed to getting you home safely?
Well, there was a strong couple, obviously, had to be with mission control and the vehicles we flew, because they had more data. Through telemetry, they had information we didn't have in the vehicle. And we spent a lot of time in training in these simulators. Neil said, and we did, we sat in them a lot, that could replicate pretty much the functions of the vehicles. Furthermore, they could, through the software, they could put in failures, what we call credible failures, that we had surmised through the whole design development phase, to test us. And there was actually set aside a group formed, SimSoup, that were, I don't know how many people there were, 10 or 12. And for each of these simulation scenarios, be there launches in the morning, entries, lunar orbit, the landing, they spent their time sitting around thinking about what failures to put in at what time, and would take great glee if they made we and mission control look bad. So we went through literally thousands of hours sitting in a simulator, as I did through those training missions, doing this sort of things. They normally gave us only approach and launch in the last month, maybe some normal, call it normal runs, so we get the feel for the real timeline. So you were geared to working with mission control. Now, furthermore, mission control had access for anything they didn't have instantly available, and they had, many of them had books on their consoles that already thought about procedures for some of these things that go wrong. Beyond that, in the normal world, they would have written up a chit. It would have gone to Building 45 next door to the MIR, Mission Evaluation Room, which had a complement of program office people, had the contract domain people, NASA engineering, and they would then handle it out to that brain trust across the country. That was back at the prime contractors, through all the subcontractors, if anything was needed, or counseling a specific person that had been in the design of that system, per se. And it's interesting, in a MIR, a double door had double doors, and they had a big sign over the top of the doors, and the sign said, "God is welcome. All others bring data." So they had access at that time. Now, Gene Kranz he took himself offline, actually out of mission control, formed a brain trust, and while working through a plan B, took that more formal bureaucratic right to chit up and pass it on to go work by the system. And he really did it a little differently. He called the key people he knew for any given open problem that was going to have to get solved on Apollo 13. He dispatched a person to go work it. And he called them in and tell them, "You have access to anybody in the United States you want, but I want you back here," and to give them a deadline to be back with their answer that would have time to be tested in a simulator, or tested, in the case of that lithium cartridge, it was actually tested in a vacuum chamber, where they deliberately induced carbon dioxide in the chamber to test the fix they had worked out. So that's the way things were done. And so there were the flight operations on board the vehicle and mission control were interwoven throughout the whole training cycle to when we flew.
So a follow-up question to that, would you be able to tell us the story of the gifts that you gave everyone who contributed to your safe return?
Now, normally we had planned on the flights to strip the limb of what was strippable. And actually we had a sheet on board and a checklist of the items. I had tools on board. I was going to remove all the hand controllers, for instance. But we were using the limb till late. In fact, we did not jettison the limb till 1 hour before entry, before we hit the air. 1 hour before is when we jettisoned the limb. And while all the time Jack and I were powering up the command module, Jim was still in the limb maintaining attitude, communications, etc. And he was using the hand controllers. So I did manage to beat off the armrest. That's what you set on behind the hand controllers, and they had little clips you could raise, and I pounded them off with a tool B. And then I ripped all the inner wall out. The LEM had no inner wall. You could look through, it was a netting material, and it was by snaps on the wall, which you could look through, and you could see the plumbing and all the wiring bundles and everything run around. But I yanked all that off and put it in a bag. I took the 2 floodlights that were on the ceiling, the connectors, so I made sure the switch was off and unplugged those and took the floodlights. So I did what I could to bring back. But what we did with the inner wall when we got back was had it cut up into 1-inch squares. And actually, we didn't do the production, but we talked to the people who then did it. And they built the boards, stiff cardboard boards about that big, and had a patch. That was Apollo 13, not a flown patch. It was a silkscreen, not flown. And below that was a 1-inch square cut of that inner wall. And then below that, Jim, Jack, and I signed. So, and there's several thousand of these. So we spent the next month passing around the office doing our signing, because actually we had a secondary set of those that used the couch material. The couches we laid in had a very thin material you laid on. And the Smithsonian, and I didn't work that, I don't know who got approval, because normally you would have not been allowed, but they let us have that material in a similar way. That was cut into 1-inch squares, more to the people who had worked on the command and service module and their key subcontractors. So that was done to award to the people who had supported the mission, and obviously, I tell you, many of them, when I talked to them when I got back, as you saw in that scene, I was getting some sleep. Many of them got less sleep than I did because of that pressure of you got to come back with these answers. So they got less sleep than I did.
And one more question for me before we open up to the audience. After you retired, you joined the board of directors of the Infinity Science Center in Biloxi, Mississippi. Could you tell us about the center, and then also what role you see museums playing today?
Yeah, after I left NASA, I had 17 years with Northrop Grumman. Ran space programs in New York 4 years, and when I formed the first service company Grumman had, and we merged, and I inherited a second service company, subsidiary company from Northrop, so I ended up running two service companies. And retired, and I was, those were pretty high-pressure jobs to meet the business plan, a lot of traveling. And I had bought a place on a bayou I used to fish in as a boy with my dad, and a little shack my wife calls my fishing hangout. And I was set to do some rocking chair time. And the fellow, Leo Seal, Mr. Seal was head of the largest bank, Hancock Bank in South Mississippi, along with Roy Estes, who was the director of Stennis, and Myron Webb, who was head of public affairs, met with me and wanted me to join the board, their foreman. Now, Roy and Myron couldn't have been on the board, but Mr. Estes was going to be the first chairman. And I thought about that, but he gave me the plan of what they had in mind, which was going to have 3 galleries, a space gallery upstairs, a Earth gallery, which included a lot of stuff about the environmental connected with the Mississippi coast, hurricanes, wetlands, that sort of thing. And then a Science Express gallery. And I thought about it a little bit because that's what attracted me. Of course, the overall Mississippi had it in mind. It's right at the border of Mississippi on Interstate 10 as you enter from Louisiana, where 8 million cars pass a year, and they thought it might be a good icon, and we have rack card for information. We might induce people to take advantage of the tourist business on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. That was the state's kind of view of that. I wanted it, of course, to tell the NASA story, particularly at Stennis, which is a little bit hidden. That's where they test rocket engines, but they do a lot more at Stennis. And it's kind of taken back from, say, Johnson with the astronauts or Kennedy that launches things. So I wanted that part to be, that was good to do. But most of all was the kind of programs and things we had in mind and this plan for children, for learning. Now, this is South Mississippi. Stennis is a tremendous technological site, but there's not much else in Mississippi that way, at least South Mississippi. So I thought that would be good to induce some of them that had the right side of the brain, or whichever side fits, to make a career if they were somewhat received a spark from attendance and the kind of programs we did at the museum. And so that was what talked me into joining the board, which I've been on now for 15 years. And at any rate, over the years, another thing I've found old astronauts can do is help museums in general with events and fundraisers, because most all are not-for-profits, and that's an ever-going mission. So I do a lot of events. I do a lot of Zoom. This summer I did 4 Zoom calls with space camp groups, one with the teacher group. So I did Skype. Skype is kind of going out of vogue, but I did a Skype group with a 2nd grade class in Clinton, Mississippi last week. And so I do a lot of these things too. And museums in general, and this of course is the granddaddy of them all in America, at least for space and airplanes, I would say. But it provides a setting where children can come in and do a program, and they're having fun. It's exciting, and they're having fun doing it. But by the way, they accidentally learn something. I call it stealth learning. And they come away from that with something in their head. It's different, not to say that the important training is done by the parents, the character building, and the pastor or whatever, and teachers at school. That's regular school. But this in museum, it's kind of a unique experience. And it kind of can tend for, and it has for children I've met over the years, sticks in their head of having that experience that can help them at least be willing to take that step and do what it needs to do to make the best use of the talent they've been born with to have a good life, contributor, and safe and healthy life.
So now we have some time for audience questions. So I ask that you please use the microphones at the sides so that the audience online can hear what you say, and then also will be part of the recording. So if you have questions, please search out a microphone. And I'll take one from YouTube as we wait. So someone who's watching online would like you to talk more about your work on the shuttle program.
Okay, the work on the shuttle program. When I finished the Apollo 16 backup assignment, it was John Young's as a backup commander. And at that time, by that time, actually, by the first 4 months in training, I knew I had lost the chance to go back to the moon on Apollo 19, which I thought I was in that 3-mission cycle. And initially had Jerry Carr and Bill Pogue assigned to me as a crew. And after 4 months, knowing those had been canceled, Deke moved them off to the last Skylab mission to get them a ride because we were running out of seats. And so they went off to Skylab, and I inherited Stu Rusa and Ed Mitchell, who had just come back off 14. Well, I finished that assignment without any chance of flying 19, and I went off to Harvard Business School. I talked to Chris Kraft and told Chris I wanted to get in management somewhere down the road. So he arranged and got me off to Harvard Business School for what was called a pressure cooker course, a 4-month cycle. Came back and went to work. I left the astronaut office and went to work for Aaron Cohen, who was the manager, the project manager for the orbiter, the Space Shuttle Orbiter. And I had an office right next to Aaron's. And I worked through the next 4 years then in that orbiter project office. So I was on the engineering change boards. I looked at every change that went through on the vehicle. I headed the ops team on all the design reviews from the PRR, the System Requirements Review, through the PDR, Preliminary and the critical design review all the way through the critical design review on Enterprise and through the preliminary design review on Columbia, which was going to be the first orbital bird. So I was just every day involved in technical meetings. We normally had every morning at 7:30 we had a meeting with subsystem managers, which the number we had took about two or 3 week cycle to get them all. We would review what's going on in the program, and it involved a lot of travel because if things weren't going right out at subs or primes, we'd go make visits and try to understand how we can help them if we could to solve the problem they were facing, and again, generally not meeting schedule. So I was in more of that vogue for those 4 years, and then obviously was blessed to then get the assignment when they decided to name the crews for the first orbiter Enterprise. And so 4 of us were named, myself and Gordon Fullerton, Joe Engle, and Dick Truly. Dick later became administrator of NASA in his later career. And so we were the crew arrived, and Bo Bobko and Bob Overmeyer were also 2 astronauts assigned to support some of the things we had to get done. So I went through the process. We split up kind of our primary roles of what we were going to be responsible for, although we coordinated mutually if we needed others' help. Like I took on the finishing of the manufacturing and getting the initial test procedures ready to test Enterprise as the parts started coming together. In fact, first time I went in the cockpit when I got out to Palmdale, half the CRTs weren't in, half the instruments, so it was still in fab mode, and they were cycling the rudder at the time, had some hydraulics up. So it was kind of, so I was with the orbiter from that day forward, and when we had tests that went, and some of them went 24 hours a day, I would ask others of our team to fly out to Palmdale and participate in those tests, because I couldn't cover 24 hours a day. So that's the way that went till we got ready to move it to Edwards, and then of course we got more directly involved in the testing there for flight, getting it serviced and ready for flight. At the same time, we did the same kind of thing we did with simulations. We had a moving base simulator that could emulate Enterprise, and we did the same kind of things with mission control through those simulations. So that was kind of it. And, it was kind of a precarious time at the time we got ready to launch. The first time, because of just what was going on in the world at that time. In fact, it's the most pressure that I'd felt any time in the program because we had this one vehicle, Enterprise, and initially in the program we had 2. We had a second one, but due to budget cuts in the initial few years of the program, we cut the second vehicle. And so we didn't have a backup test vehicle. Columbia could not have been quickly turned to fly that program. So I knew you don't like to have a test program with only one vehicle. So at any rate, so the bad news in the background, NASA had to announce, because of the tile problem, a 2-year slip in the potential first orbital flight. So more bad news. On top of that January we had changed presidents. The program had been started under President Nixon, and President Jimmy Carter had come in. And it was never clear how President Carter felt, well, about space in general, and their debates and space was never discussed. So it wasn't clear. I kind of hoped he was an engineer, although a submariner. I hoped that he would have some affinity for this flying machine, but you didn't know. So I was concerned about that. Had we damaged or crashed Enterprise, that could have been the end of the program right there. Jimmy, in the second month in, I think, canceled the B-1 bomber program, which didn't have anything to do with NASA, but that was nevertheless, that was aerospace. So that was what was kind of in my mind. I sure hope things went well. Safety-wise, I was not worried about myself and Gordo. We were sitting in ejection seats, so we had a good plan B. I was really worried about Fitz Fulton and Tom McMurtry and Vic Harton and Skip Guidry. 4 people in that carrier aircraft had the primary system going berserk as we separated. That's the first time we'd have see how it handled if it didn't go unstable. And if we'd have, somehow lost control before I could push one button, which would kill 4 computers, and switch to a 5th one we had with a backup system, much simpler control system to keep it under control, but it was good enough to get it on the ground. And it damaged the 747, those people would not have made it. So that, from the standpoint of worrying about and who took the risk, it was those 747 pilots, Gordo and I.
I see we have some questions up there. So the microphone's actually the middle on the platform. Sorry, I said it was at the edge. I can't quite see, but I see that there's a person up there. Do you have a question?
Apollo 13 is mostly famous for the difficulties you had to overcome. Was there anything during the mission, probably in the first 3 days, that went better than expected? Something you'd worried about during training that ended up being not much of a problem or even positive?
Anything that went better? Well, obviously the way that what went better was how the systems performed, even though we didn't freeze in the LEM. We didn't, like the command module, the water tanks were frozen. They were found frozen, in fact, when they were recovered on board the Iwo Jima after entry. But we were probably in the high 30s, I guess. So the fact that electronics and what we were running, it wasn't that, we wasn't fully powered up to save power, but it all worked just, I'd say, as per specification. Now, even more impressive was the command module, because the command module, we shut it down, it had the mothership. It never been planned to ever be shut down, and sat there those 4 days, and like I said, froze the water tanks. And Jack and I powered that vehicle up. They didn't get the procedure to us to 17 hours before entry, which had to be invented, since the mothership was never supposed to be powered down. There wasn't any procedure to power it up. So they had about 3.5 days to figure that out. I had tested it in simulators with a number of other astronauts to perfect the procedure. But then secondarily, we had no blank paper on board, so Jack Schweiger copied, and he had to rip the backs off checklist to write that step-by-step procedure down on the startup and carefully number the pages. Then we were not allowed to start the power up till 2.5 hours before we were going to hit the air at 25,000 miles an hour. So Jack and I crawled into the command module about 3 hours before, and looked around, and it's completely dark and tomb. We had flashlights, water everywhere. Jack got out a couple of towels, so we had to wipe off the instrument panel that was covered with water. And Jack thought about it, and when we got ready to power up, the first steps on the power up was to push in all the circuit breakers. There was big circuit breaker panels on each side, and Jack would be pushing them in on one side, at me on the other. And Jack said, I'll give you a countdown, and let's push in only 6 circuit breakers at a time and stop and see if we smell insulation burning. So that's the way we went through that initial power up to get all the circuit breakers in. And then we continued with the power up, and it was like, it was a secondary miracle of that mission, because everything came to life, worked perfectly. Jack got a good star alignment. And like I said, then we got rid of the LEM about an hour before we hit the air, and it did a fully automated entry. Jack we had a backup way to take over manually if you had to, but he hooked it up through automated through the computer, and it flew that whole entry. And from the post-flight data, as best I can tell, touch splash down to the ship of all the missions. We shared the record for being the closest, tied for second in the whole program. So all that equipment which we severely abused, violated specifications on, had come to life and had that performance to get us back.
Do we have another question?
Thank you so much for speaking with us. Could you speak about your work on the backup crews? It's mentioned that you were on several backup crews, and I've read that you were really outstanding in your performance and what your contributions were. So could you please talk about your work as a member of the backup crew and how that contributed to the success of the Prime mission? Thanks.
Well, on the first missions, Apollo 8 and a few things on 11, as a backup and prime crew on meetings where we were still devising procedures or talking about takeover limits and things like that, we worked as a group. So you could say, well, it played a role just as well as the prime crew in settling down on how we're going to handle things if we had flown for certain things, because we worked. In meetings, we were all together. We kind of split the time on when we were in simulators and that kind of thing. So no, I don't think I played any extra superb role as a backup than any other backup might have played on other missions in that time frame. I think Deke had it right, and I believe that was true. Of the group we flew that were predominantly pilots and test piloting background in those days, he felt, and I think you could, basically any astronaut of that vintage could have flown any mission equally. So that there wasn't a lot of choice that way as far as the capability and the background experience and how they would handle themselves if they flew. So I think that was a feeling Deke had. And I'd say that was pretty accurate for that day and time, for the kind of selection criteria and who got selected at that time.
Just another question?
Good evening. The Apollo missions inspired many generations to get involved with space and continue to inspire more people to get involved with space. What advice would you give to a young professional in the space sector? And additionally, how can we tell the story of the Apollo mission, specifically Apollo 13, to continue to inspire future generations to get involved with space?
Well, Apollo 13 is a good story that the movie actually, the big story movie, the movie Apollo 13 carried well, of showing people that had a problem, a big problem, and showing this team that came together to solve the problem. Now, I hope the young person in aerospace, you maybe somewhat looks at that as they're thinking about doing it, as something to enthuse them of, there's going to probably be some things that are challenging, things that are going to be difficult to go through design development, unknowns. And I hope that's somewhat of an inspiration that way to meet those challenges. But I hope most of their attention when they're on the job is on the challenges they have at hand, which in each program, there's often a different set of challenges, some just as difficult to worry about, that they'd mostly be concentrating on. I'm talking someone who's already employed and on the job, either with a new aircraft or a new spacecraft, that they have that in front of them they have to worry about. And any new thing you do, be it a new high-performance airplane with newer, fancier systems, stealth, you name it, each have their own new, unique challenges that, as an engineer or designer, one has to deal with. And as a pilot, one has to play into that to assure the cockpit, the functions, and the systems all are usable by an operator. And so that's what every new thing. And that's the nice thing about aerospace is generally it's not a static world. It's everything you go into, not just considering airplanes and spacecraft, but anything technical normally has next door you open has got something new.
So another question from the online audience. Test pilots and astronauts are known to be superstitious. Did any of your post-Apollo crews have an issue with you being assigned to their crew?
What was that? I'm sorry.
So test pilots and astronauts are known to be superstitious. Did any of your post-Apollo crews have an issue with you being assigned to their crew?
Did any
Were
of,
they worried you might bring them bad luck?
No, I don't think so. No, I think some were envious. It was certainly the case within my group. Some had to wait a lot longer, and again, as a case, we had more people, frankly, with our pick, than there were missions and seats and left. So I felt bad about that. That some people spent quite a few years before they got their first assignment and got to fly.
Next question.
Yeah, after the first moon landing, public interest in NASA and the whole moon program tanked dramatically. You, of course, managed to spark that up a bit. However, what would you have done differently if you, from the NASA point of view, in order to keep up interest? I mean, we would love to have seen those moon bases and the other stuff that were originally planned.
Well, I'm not sure what I could have done. What it needs to have, you talk moon base even, or certainly Mars base, you have to have something other than just going there to explore a particular area to set up. What's the return for setting up a base? And people keep talking about economic return for, I think, to have the proper continuous, which it takes, congressional funding support to do that, to sustain it. A moon base, I mean, it's very much like the bases we have in Antarctica that operate year-round. And that's another, incidentally, I did a Zoom call with, it was a space hipster at Antarctica. And I arranged to have a Zoom call with the team that was at the winter crew at Antarctica about several months ago. Interesting, it was 97 degrees Fahrenheit in Houston, and they were at minus 71 degrees Fahrenheit. But it takes that permanent crew, it takes a logistics supply chain to support operations. It's going to be very expensive. There's no really cheap way. So it goes back to that basic question, after you do it once or twice, why do you continue doing it? And that's the argument. And the why for that has to have something selling behind it to make it happen and make it be properly supported to actually do that. Now, it's differently if you can do an argument for new, say, unmanned stations, like they're talking a mission to go to Saturn. And it's a new mission and it's a new exploration. So you can have scientists can develop a set of arguments to why that would be useful. But to actually set up permanent operations somewhere, it's going to have stronger backing than I just want a permanent base sitting on the moon, I think, to actually eventually be in the Congress in the U.S. or China, for that matter, anybody to support the kind of logistics needs to have that happen and be supported on a continual basis.
Another question?
A few years ago, Michaud took the remaining first stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle out of mothballs to be placed on display. Was that first stage sent to the Infinity Science Center for display, or is it on display elsewhere?
The one that we have at Infinity?
Yes, sir.
It was I was told anyway, it was the last one built at Michoud in New Orleans, and it was slated to be the first stage for Apollo 19. So it was the one that would have lifted me off if we had flown 19. So we only got the one stage. Unfortunately, we've had to do quite a bit of rework, refurbishment on it. because Michoud, in spite of having this building that's 40 acres under air conditioning, huge facility, they left it parked outside for quite a number of years. So we've had to do quite a bit of work on it to get it looking better. But I didn't know, was that kind of answered the question you had?
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay.
Was there another question from the audience?
I'd like to ask Can you hear me, sir?
We have another person up at the mic. Sorry, we'll have to prioritize the microphones for the general audience in the recording. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, sir. My name is Dino. I used to work for you on the space station. Do you mind to give us some examples on the challenges on the space station? I know that you have many examples that you can to give us as a program manager point of view working on the space station.
All right, I'm not sure I got all of that question.
So the question was about challenges on the space station? Is that?
Yes, sir. On the, you used to be the program manager on the here at the space station, or the Grammar Space Station. And do you mind to give us some examples on the challenges that you used to have on the space station? And you know, we have many challenges.
I'm sorry, you're talking about space station now?
Yes, sir.
Or maybe the space shuttle? We could.
No, in the space station, the Grammar Space Station here in Reston. You used to be the program manager.
Oh, the Grumman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I one of the contracts I won was a support contract to do the system engineering integration on Space Station Freedom, it was called then. And obviously later became ISS. I don't know, maybe that was because the Russians joined the program and they didn't like the word freedom, I guess, in the title. But at any rate, became the ISS. No, I worked on that also. I worked 4 years running that contract, supporting NASA management was at Reston, Virginia.
For this reason, we used to have many problems, and you handle all the problems very, very nicely. And although that we have different centers, different opinions, how to handle the space.
I'm still having trouble. You have to excuse me. I'm approaching 89 years old, and part of my defect also is hearing, and a couple of frequencies. I'm not getting the question.
Do you mind to tell us any challenges that you had on the NASA space station when you used to work as here in Reston, Virginia?
So I think, and this will be the last.
What did he say, Bill?
Challenges on the space station.
The biggest challenges was getting the next budget cycle through, which is a concern right now with the midterms coming up, frankly. But no, I spent a lot of time actually away from my, I call it my technical job, lobbying downtown to try to make sure we kept the budget. It was very difficult. My staff meetings. Normally, I'd call it, I'd gotten readings from our lobbying office down in Alexandria. So I kind of, from them, I tried to keep track of the votes and whether we're going to survive. I mean, that next budget cycle, we'd be gone. Proxmire zeroed it 1 year completely, and I think it took very quickly, it was turned around. So it was all those machinations. That was the big challenge, was to make do with what we had, which was always, even when approved, was less than the program plan. So we restructured Space Station 3 times while I was there in 4 years. Yeah, and so that's what you do. If you try to make ends meet, the whole schedule, you take content out. And it's a lesser vehicle, you might say, in some ways, but that's the way you try to keep going and get flying. And so that was a challenge those days. And in the book, at the end of that chapter section, I call that my time in purgatory.
So we have time for just one more brief question.
Good evening, Fred. I have a question at the end of a little story about you. I worked with you also up here in Reston, Space Station Freedom, and one of the challenges we worked with you was the failure management and the caution and warning. There's a lot of single point failures on the system, Space Station avionics system, and we spent a lot of time with you going over how can we not have a repeat of Apollo 13. And so I just wanted to let you know that I came here tonight just to see you again. That was 30 years ago. I'm sure you don't remember me, and that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to let you know that I'm at the end of my career, and I wanted to establish a scholarship for young students. And so I've established one at University of Colorado Aerospace Engineering Department. And when my handler, if you will, said, well, you can name it whatever you want. Why don't you put your name on it? And I said, well, no one knows who I am. And he said, well, think of somebody that inspired you throughout your career. And I said, well, that'd be Fred Haise. So there's a scholarship being started next year.
Thank you.
It's the Fred Haise Honorary Scholarship at CU. And my question is that okay with you?
That is a wonderful way to close this conversation. I think we recognize we could go on and on through the evening, but in respect for everybody's time, I think we'll close with that. And please join me in thanking Fred Haise and Teasel on what was a memorable conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.